right, what we are now going to do is transition to brief responses among the panelists, and then after that we will go into general Q&A. So the first response, and this gives me an opportunity to correct my pronunciation of his name, is Andrew Loke. He is not Odin's blood brother, as I had thought. So Andrew, please.
And I'm very grateful to Professor Jack Collins for his paper. As you all can hear, he is actually very supportive of the work that myself and Dr. Craig are doing. And I think after reading his paper, I think that there's just one minor critique that he has, which I need to respond to. Okay, so Collins mentioned that Loke's suggestion that we could have a specially created Adam and Eve within a fairly recent history to give universal human ancestry by AD 1 cannot work. Not simply as to the scientific problems, but also to the theological side. The corruption of humankind is already visible in the earliest writings we have from ancient civilizations in Sumer, Egypt, China, and probably also in the paleontological records. So we must have the origin of this corruption much earlier in order to be so widely spread, really back to the headwaters, he says. Loke seems to be happy with a much older Adam, although he has also argued the more recent model. Okay, unquote. So this is Collins' criticism. Now, Collins is right to point out that I'm not committed to a recent Adam view. Okay, so on my view, my GAE model, I defend two versions of it. One is the recent Adam version, and the other is the older Adam version. So Dr. Collins is correct to point out that I'm also happy with an older Adam version too. And by older, I mean it could be really old, right? So I'm willing to follow the evidence where it leads. So for example, it could be as old as 50,000 or 100,000 possibly. But I have also defended the recent version view, okay? And by recent, what I mean, okay, so what do you mean by recent Adam, right? Now, the reason for this demarcation between recent and Adam is because when we read Genesis, for example, right, it portrays Cain to be somebody who is doing farming, and it seems that Abel is also doing, that there is also domestication of animals as well, it seems, in the Genesis record. So how do we interpret those? Okay, if we interpret it literally, as there is actually literal farming going on rather than anachronistically, as John Collins also has argued for, then we need to ask, so when did farming start? When did agriculture start? When did human beings start to have domestication, right, of animals? Now, if we look at the paleoanthropological records, right, so many scientists used to argue that it was around the Neolithic era, right, around 10,000 years ago. And so this is the recent Adam view, right? It comes from there, so as recent as around the Neolithic era. But however, we know that this scientific evidence about exactly when did these activities started in the record, actually the dates, the timeline has been constantly changing, right? So nowadays, there are some scientists who think that, okay, maybe there's evidence that people practice domestication maybe as far back as 17,000 years ago, rather than just 10,000, right? So it could be, say, for example, during it's the ending of the last ice age, right, just before the Neolithic era. So the timeline could go could we go earlier, right? So what that means is that the recent Adam view can also go back earlier as well. But not as long back as 50,000 or 100,000, there'll be an older view, right? Because during that time, there's no evidence of agriculture, at least not discovered yet. But maybe we'll discover in the future, we don't know. But these things are changing, shifting, right? But here, I'm just want to clarify what does recent mean and what does ancient means. So I hope this is clear. So given these clarifications, now, first of all, I'm not committed to saying that AD 1, right, is the date that everybody becomes, by then everybody has the image of God. Rather, I argue that it could be way before that, right? When Paul makes a statement in Acts chapter 17, right? Of course, he's referring to something that has already happened. So how far back did it happen? Well, as I say, if you hold to the recent variants, right, it could go as far back as 17,000, right? Maybe during the last ice age. And so it could go further back. And if that's the case, then it wouldn't face any of the scientific problems or the theological problems that Collins mentioned, right? Because he mentioned about the writings of people in Sumer, Egypt, China. Now that is only in the last few thousand, right? Say 5,000-6,000 years ago. But if you go further back, 17,000, by the time descendants spread across to different parts of the world, that wouldn't be a problem. And so that would be my response, right, to Collins. I think that both the recent variant and the ancient variant, both are defensible, and I see no problem with either views. Now, on this point, I also want to say something more about my response to Michael Keas' favorite model, because on his view, Adam and Eve were created at least 500,000 years ago, or even 1.5 million years ago, such that even earlier human-like members of Homo, such as Homo erectus, could be viewed as God's image bearers. Right? So that is Keas' favorite model. However, the problem with his model is that it fails to consider when did the image of God qualities, such as religiosity and having a relationship with the creator God, actually appear in the paleoanthropological records. Now, this consideration is very relevant given the biblical teaching that God created human beings in his image with an awareness of God himself, being able to be aware of God and to represent him to govern the world. Now, archaeological and historical evidence indicates that the worship of the creator God only began a few thousand years ago. Now, future research may or may not discover evidence earlier than that, right? So as I say, I'm happy to follow the evidence. It could be, maybe in the future, we'll discover evidence 50,000 years ago, perhaps. And my GAE model can follow the evidence wherever it leads, given that I'm not committed to a very strict recent Adam view. Although I think that at the present, both views are defensible at this present time, given the evidence that we have at this present time. Now, however, by contrast, Michael Keas' favorite model does not have this flexibility. So my model can be flexible, I can follow the evidence, but his model cannot have this flexibility because he wants to avoid the data concerning population genetics. Now, I think that the problem with his model is that it doesn't have this flexibility and he has to go very far back. And I think that it is implausible to think that humans made in the creator God's image existed for hundreds and thousands of years, or even 1 million years. 1 million years without any evidence of recognition of the creator God until just a few thousand years ago, right? That doesn't seem plausible to me. And therefore, Keas' favorite model scores low for fittingness with the data as a theoretical virtue compared to my model, which follows the evidence. And so given that Keas' evaluation of my GAE model in light of other theoretical virtues are based on multiple misrepresentations and also other errors of reasoning, which I pointed out previously, and given that Keas' favorite model scores low for fittingness with the data, as I've established, the GAE model which I defend is more theoretically virtuous compared to Keas' view. Thank you.
All right, and the second response now will be from William Lane Craig.
Michael Keas is to be commended for not stacking the deck by choosing as a panelist an Old Testament scholar who would be sympathetic to his own views, but rather choosing a scholar like John Collins who is sympathetic with the target of Keas' criticisms. The differences between my view and Collins' view of Genesis 1 to 11 are mainly semantic or terminological. He's unhappy with categorizing Genesis 1 to 11 as mytho-history, with the consequent alertness to elements of the fantastic. For, he says, while the label has some positive features in its favor, it produces troubles that we do not need to have. He thinks that the term suffers from being etic rather than emic. It represents how an outsider to Mesopotamian culture sees the stories. He says that we might be better off supposing that the Mesopotamians considered themselves to be telling history with myth-like characteristics. This is a distinction without a difference. Whether the nomenclature is etic or emic, all that is relevant is its accuracy. After considering alternative etic labels like prehistory, proto-history, and archetypal history for Genesis 1 to 11, Collins settles on rhetorical history. Now, that label is fine with me so long as we recognize what kind of literature we're talking about. Collins rightly says, and I quote, "Traditional Jews and Christians recognize that Genesis 1 to 11 are historically referential while allowing for pictorial description." That is exactly my position. And I noted that Collins reciting the mere Athanasian reading of Genesis 1 to 11 is almost identical to the summary I give in the book of the central teachings of these chapters for us. The reason I prefer the label mytho-history is because it is not idiosyncratic like these other alternatives that have been mentioned, but it connects most closely with the work of classicists and folklorists. And we respect the intelligence of Christian laymen when we do not try to sugarcoat our conclusions, but rather we state them plainly and explain them clearly.
And then finally, the response from Michael Keas.
So while it's warming up, this is a bonus feature here. The terminological only, when the slides come up, I'll show you, it is definitely more than just a terminological difference between Craig and Collins. His rhetorical history, that is, Collins is emphasizing that it's a social event and you communicate with a mixture of figurative and literal language to convey real historical events. Collins is committed to Eve derived from Adam. Craig denies that. So that's a huge difference, and it has implications for gender roles today, having a theology that's solid enough to handle that. So it was regarding, that Collins thinks that Eve derived from Adam happened historically, but the story includes figurative and literal language to convey that sequence of events. And Craig thinks that Eve was not derived from Adam, and that allows him to speculate about a genetically modified organism, for Eve being a GMO, basically, in his last chapter of his book, that Eve was derived from an animal, not from Adam. So it's very important to him to be able to oppose Collins on this issue. And so it's not just a terminological issue. Okay, so Craig is inconsistent in that he takes a sample from only Genesis 18 to say that Genesis 18 was theophany, God appearing physically, but he neglects to look at Genesis 17, where you have the trait of ritual. And so he's inconsistent, but he really, where the inconsistency really lies in a more substantial way is his faulty distinction between miracle and fantastic. So this is new. This is the new part here to respond to him. Let's see, get rid of that. So according to Craig, that Gen 2 is fantastic because it's not a theophany miracle, that is, a physical appearance of God miracle. And he thinks it's not theophany because God is described as human even when not appearing. This is in his book, not in his paper, but in his book. So, such as when Eve was being created. Obviously, when Adam and Eve were unconscious, they couldn't see God, right? If God appeared. Well, the same thing is happening in Genesis 18. Part of the time when God is standing there by the tent with two angels, he's not appearing to Abraham because Abraham went into the tent. So there's part of the time, even in Genesis 18, when God cannot be appearing to Abraham. So this is this distinction between Genesis 2 as fantastic myth and Gen 18 as real miracle fails. He's inconsistent about that. In fact, he ignores two better options regarding Genesis 2. God could have appeared in a theophany most of the time, similar to Genesis 18. Or option 2, even if it's not a theophany, let's suppose God didn't appear in a physical form, it could still be real events conveyed by a mix of literal and figurative language, such as in Deuteronomy 32,
where it says of the Jews that had just finished wandering in the wilderness, that God guided them, which he did, but that they were the apple of his eye, a figurative language. Both a more literal and more figurative language refer to actual real events in the desert wandering around. So Craig's fantastic conclusion, that is, concluding that the trait of fantastic is in Gen 2, therefore that's the myth trait, ignores better options such as options 1 and 2. And I think his motivation for this, and he can correct me if I'm wrong, is in his book, he says he wants to consider the possibility that Eve was a GMO, genetically modified organism, not derived from Adam, but from an advanced animal. So now Craig also says that the language of theophany is missing in Gen 2 and 3, but it is in Genesis 18, where it literally says the Lord appeared. So this is odd that Craig thinks that in order for it to count as theophany, it must literally tell us the Lord appeared or something similar to that. Whereas Poythress, who's got a book-length treatment on theophany that's well-respected, says Genesis 2 to 3 can very well show us, without telling us in a literal, explicit way, that God showed up in a physical form, such as the language of God, the description of God bringing Eve to Adam, or the walking sound that God made. What's a good way to make a walking sound? Well, maybe by having a physical body and walking, right? God could have done it another way, but he's showing us that it could have been an actual physical body, and so on. Now, Poythress says, even if this is not theophany, Genesis 2 and 3, it's definitely real events of history, which Craig denies that Eve was derived from Adam. That would be the most important denial that Poythress and Collins and I agree on, and even Loke agrees that also is compatible with Scripture, of a good reading of Scripture, that Eve could be derived from Adam. Now, Craig says that I have a literal interpretation of Genesis in his paper, and that I must harmonize this with science. Well, in a longer version of my paper that I sent him much longer ago, I give Collins-style reasons for why Gen 1 is analogical days, not literal days. And I give reasons for a regional flood, not local, that's one extreme, and not universal, but a regional flood. And I think these are easy to harmonize with science. And yet, in his same paper today, he says Keas and I agree that we should not interpret Gen 1 through 11 with wooden literalism. That conflicts with his other statement. So there's a lot of confusion here. Now, Collins agrees with me, and he even verified this in email, that Craig has conceded too much about the historicity of Gen 2, for example, Eve derived from Adam's side. And he approved even me using this slide to quote him, that these texts really do imply the actuality of their events. Yes, they're described in literal and figurative language, but it implies the actuality of these events. Now, regarding the myth sample, Craig has understood part of what I was trying to say there. In the quotation that he quotes, that I also quote, he left out the part in bold, where this myth expert says, Greek myths are fictions, we would now say. But, of course, to the ancient Greeks, they had explanatory power. That part he quoted, the last part. But he left out the part in bold, which is evidence. I'm not mind reading. This is one of the few experts who impolitely, against etiquette, say that, of course, we don't believe the actual event, that the event sequences of Greek mythology actually happened. And so I'm not mind reading here. It's based on evidence. And so most myth experts today don't believe in the event sequences that their myths that they study describe, right? That's pretty obvious. And of course, Craig similarly doesn't believe that Eve was derived from Adam. That's more of the mythos part of his mytho-history. Now, Craig does say that he doesn't even apply his theory beyond Genesis 1 to 11. And he says it's an open question. There could be more mytho-history. We'll see what we find. But on his own website, he says that these myth criteria don't characterize Genesis 12 through 50, and which definitely don't belong to this genre. This is utter confusion. So, and furthermore, he challenges me to have a full genre analysis that would be different than his genre analysis. But Collins and I don't think this is barking up the right tree. That there is that we think that this kind of genre analysis is too blunt a tool. It's trying to do too much in one fell swoop. Whereas Collins' more nuanced approach to interpreting the text takes into account a lot of other things, not trying to just solve everything with a genre identification. And so concludes that Eve was derived from Adam, as I do, rather than denying it like Craig does. Now as to Loke, responding to Loke, these animal spouses. Now, yes, it is core to his theory that humans mated with animals. That's one of the whole point. And Swamidass also. But, well, anyway, that are humans, we'll get to that later. But it's core that there's some kind of interbreeding. Adam and Eve with people outside the garden. That's core to the theory.
Not animals.
Right. You relabel them as humans or something like humans or persons, whatever. So Loke says, okay, since we're focusing on Loke for the sake of this conference session, that Loke says that there's two ways it could be done, by God's will or against it. But in his book, he gives 5 reasons for plan A, God's will, but no good reasons for plan B. But so I challenge his plan A, as I focused on the one that he emphasized, and shows how it fails to cohere with God's attributes. The animal spouse, how could that be good, given that they would have a marriage with children, would be with deficient nurturing and so on, the points I made earlier. So Loke concedes, okay, let's change to plan B. It was against God's will. But he adds a new hypothesis that was not in his book, that it's a test for humanity. He's designed them so they could interbreed, but don't do it. It's just a test. Well, here the human inclination for animal sex is a result of God deliberately making us so that we could have sex with animals and reproduce, including the language bridge for sex talk and family talk. Okay? And he even thinks that this is biologically superior way to spread the image of God, to have more genetic diversity. So in other words, God's saying, yes, I've designed all this exquisitely so they can all happen. It would be a better way to spread the image of God, but don't do it. This is just a sex test. Okay? This is implausible. And furthermore, this interbreeding with animals is not even needed, because to explain current genetic diversity, if you go back to 500K or back, there's a really solid case. You don't even need interbreeding with people outside the garden or animals, whatever you want to call them. You don't need that. You don't need to have that. So now, if you go with a more recent Adam and Eve, of course, then that makes it a little more challenging. But even there may be, depending on how recent you go, there could be ways to explain that diversity. It's on a sliding scale. So Loke's theory is getting more and more complicated, and I think incoherent, as he's bouncing from plan A, which was the only thing he really solidly defended in his book. I showed why it doesn't hold. Now he's booted on that and goes with plan B. Now, as far as the racist comment, of course, Loke himself is not racist, but his theory is regarding ancient communities. Now, he's taken a modern dictionary and says what? It defines racism as, within the human family, but different ethnic groups, and calling them inferior ethnic groups. But this recent definition of racism ignores the history of racism. In the 19th century, there were many forms of racism where it considered other ethnic groups as not even human. And scholars today routinely label that racism. So Loke's animal spouses in ancient communities do count as racism. So in conclusion, although I have one bonus slide after this, Loke, Keas, Collins, and Nathan French, Dr. French, at the end there, we all oppose Craig in regard to Genesis 2 and 3, where we think that often the text can show more than it tells by the bare words. Okay? So this literalist bare words approach that triggers the fantastic, we think, is not a legitimate approach, which is the only way that he really gets to mytho-history, because that's the only trait that really distinguishes Genesis 1 to 11 from most other parts of the Old Testament. So it's really not a strong inference at all. Now, Craig and Keas agree that Loke is pushing against a more ancient view. Of course, he's open to an older Adam, but he really wants to push for a younger Adam, because then you would need the interbreeding with people outside the garden or animals, whatever you want to call them. Now, Loke is pushing against that by citing the absence of archaeological evidence for religion. and saying that this absence of these archaeological evidence for religion is evidence of absence. But this is a fallacy if we have good reasons to think that early religion would have not involved objects that would be likely to be preserved. And Dr. Nathan French and I have talked about this at all in terms of A&E, and Old Testament is his specialty. And it's very likely that things were rarely preserved, and you could have hundreds of thousands, even millions of years without any archaeological trace of this. And Dr. Craig and I agree that you could have a very plausible older Adam and Eve, even though they're in the image of God, without evidence from archaeology. Now, our book project, Dr. Casey Luskin and Dr. French and I, we're going to have a book. This conference session is really helping us. I'm so grateful that you guys are helping us to think through these things to make sure that in the book we finally have the very, very best arguments. One bonus slide and I'm done. All right. Now, Dr. Craig has said several times that he doesn't apply his theory beyond Genesis 1 to 11. But in his book, he refers to Genesis 2 and 3. He says, you need to interpret this, understand this in the larger context of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, and even, of course, even beyond that. And he says such a wider perspective is necessary if we're to do our job responsibly. Well, for him to do his job responsibly, he should have been consistent with his own advice and applied his theory to Exodus, and then it would have turned up all 10 traits. Now, regarding the Exodus not being primeval, he quotes the same person that I quote who says, well, it could have been myth, it could have been this. Well, primeval is a relative term. The primeval, the little yellow star is on my timeline on the bottom there. If you judge it from the time the Old Testament was mostly completed by some scholars, let's say the 5th century, then the Exodus was 800 years before that, and that would seem very remote to them. And furthermore, Craig calls Genesis 1 to 11 Israel's foundational myth. But wait a minute, he doesn't mean Israel as a person, he means the nation. When was the nation founded? At the Exodus. There was no nation before then. And the text of Exodus even says that. Israel's, let my firstborn go, my firstborn nation. So there we go. That's my final slide. Thank you.
So we're now going to move to more general discussion. I can give just a few moments for our panelists, very briefly though, because I want to be able to open it to the floor. And because we have Judge Swamidass here as well, I'd like to give him a few minutes. So let's see. Bill, is there anything you would like to say just briefly, please?
I would just say that I think I'm really grateful for this last response by Michael, because I think it just illustrated how the wheels have fallen off of this cart, and that it just does not offer a very compelling case against the genre analysis that I offer. Just to name one point, if you recognize that the creation story of Eve is pictorial, as John Collins says, then what do you mean that Eve is derived from Adam? If there wasn't a surgery that was performed on Adam while he was unconscious and a rib floated out of his side into the air and a woman was built out of it, if that's pictorial, then what in the world does it mean that she's derived from him? I don't understand what that means. So I think Collins is on the same footing as I am. We both agree that you have underlying historical persons and events, but these are just filled with pictorial or metaphorical figurative images that don't need to be taken literally.
Or Andrew, and then we'll come back to Michael.
All right, thank you. Thanks, Michael, for your response. Now, I want to respond to the points you raised. Now, first of all, you say that in my book I gave 5 reasons for Plan A, but I didn't give any reason for Plan B. Now, the reason why I give 5 reasons for Plan A is because Plan A, that is God's will, is actually more difficult to defend, right? Because actually, if you ask me which option do I prefer, I would prefer Plan B, actually. I would say that it's actually not God's will, it's actually in disobedience to God's will, because it sounds awful, right, to get an animal wife. In fact, that was my own preferred version until I came across Joshua Swamidass' feedback on my book, and that's how I also think that, well, maybe Plan A is defensible as well. That's how I end up considering Plan A too. right? And I think that maybe Plan A is still defensible for all we know, but I just don't have time to talk about it today, and that's why I focus on Plan B today. It doesn't mean that I gave up. It doesn't mean that I changed anything, right? So then you say that, well, Plan B also doesn't work because why would God give us such a test, right? It seems implausible. But then again, we need to also ask, right? So why? But then again, we also need to think. Okay, so nowadays we know that some people do commit the sin of bestiality, right? So people do mate with animals, and on your view, it seems that God should have created humans in such a way that anatomically we shouldn't be able to have sex with animals at all, right? If that is not God's view, but that's obviously not the case. I mean, people can have sex with animals against God's will, and then they can derive pleasure from it, right? So this could be understood as a test, right? A testing that we shouldn't, even if it's pleasurable, we shouldn't do it, right? Because we should follow God, and so I don't see what is implausible about my postulation. Now, and then you say that, well, God, you don't need to have this model in which Cain have sex with animals, but whether you need or not, right? That's a different issue. It depends on where you date Adam, right? And in any case, it's relevant as an objection to my model because I'm just suggesting a possibility. Whether you need it or not, that's a different thing. I'm arguing that given this model, it is a possible model, regardless of whether you need it or not. Now, and I do think that there is a need for this, right? If given other considerations, if we need to date Adam not too far back as you do, right? Now, I will come to that point. That's your third point, right? Okay. But now, let me go to the second point about racism. You say that, well, this word has been used in different ways. Last century ago, some people use it to label people as not even human, right? But the point why we think that they shouldn't do that is precisely because we think that they are humans, and that's why we think that they shouldn't be labeled as not humans. So again, it's based on the assumption of what human being. What does it mean to be humans? And therefore, my response to your initial paper stands, right? I think that you are claiming that your objection about the very ancient view is based on the assumption that those people are in fact human. That's why you think that they shouldn't be labeled as not humans. But again, I said this is based on fallacious or rather unwarranted scientific, philosophical, and biblical assumptions, right? So my response to you stands as well. Now, on your final point, you mentioned about evidence of religion, the absence of which doesn't mean that no evidence doesn't mean that there's no evidence. And then you say that some things may not leave signs in the archaeological record. But we do have evidence, say, for example, of burial practices, rituals related to afterlife, right? So I do think that if a person recognizes that there's a creator God and have view about eternity, then they would need to think about what happens to people after they die, right? So I think these are very much connected, especially if you hold to a biblical point of view. And God created Adam and then put eternity into the hearts, as the Ecclesiastes say. And we do have evidence of that, of burial practices. Archaeological record, but then again, those evidence don't go far back as 1 million years, right? As Homo erectus. I mean, they are fairly recent. They are about 50,000 years ago. Now, that doesn't entail that. Therefore, these people are aware of image. They are aware of Creator God. So, having belief in afterlife doesn't entail belief in Creator God. But I do think that having capacity for belief in Creator God does entail having belief of afterlife too. Okay, so I think that this evidence does create problems, but does falsify your model. Right?
All right, and just very briefly.
Yeah. Okay, so Collins has confirmed with me that the pictorial language and the literal language, the mix of the two, regarding Eve derived from Adam, is consistent with Eve actually being derived from Adam. That is, Adam was missing a part. And it's in terms of the cartoonish, depiction of the floating rib. You're committed to the possibility of a genetically modified organism, Eve, which would involve molecules floating through the air or suddenly changing. For God to be a genetic engineer would require a microsurgery. So why is microsurgery not fantastic, but macrosurgery is? I think that's arbitrary. Now, regarding Loke...
Michael, it is contrary to professional etiquette to cite private communications that are unpublished and therefore not available for documentation. When I was in forensic debate activities, for example, one of the things that you could not do is appeal to anecdotal evidence. Like, I got an email from Collins where he says this. You need to appeal to published work that's available to all of us and not to private anecdotal.
He was summarizing his publications. He was summarizing his public available link, and he approved it being used because it was summarizing the what he had
Then
published.
you need to base your case
Yeah,
on
I'm sorry I didn't make that clear.
publications,
I didn't make that clear, but he himself was saying it was based on his own public publications.
Yes, but again, saying, he says this, you are appealing to this private communication rather than
Well, I'm just
to
saying
public
this private communication
materials.
points to the public publications.
Right, and so you
So it
need
amounts
to
to the
base
same
your
thing.
argument on those public publications
Yeah.
and not on what he told you personally. That's a violation of
Yeah.
professional
And-
etiquette.
Collins didn't think it was a violation.
Well, of course not. He was talking to you personally.
No,
I might say
no.
you any
He
better.
gave me permission to share it
All
with
right.
that group. So he
I'm
didn't think.
I'm gonna gavel this because there's a lot of people with questions, and that's a more of a personal issue. I would, because he's president, I would like to ask Judge Swamidass to just come up and make a few remarks. Again, go short because we want to give people in the audience the time for their questions. So come up here so you'll get on the recording, please.
So I'm speaking with very little preparation. I'm going to make this very brief. First of all, I just wanted to thank everyone here for engaging this work. I think this is really important for the church. And if we can give them a hand again, too, I think that's really important. I think this is also the fun of it. We're dealing with things that are part of the reason why I think, there's can be emotions that kind of come to the surface, things like that, is we're talking about what it means to be human. This is important stuff. This is, these questions about Adam and Eve are kind of like the crossroads of so many important issues in theology. So this stuff matters, and we have different opinions on it, and it's good for us to be going back and forth debating it. So I just want to thank you for that. Thank you also for joining this conversation too, Michael. I'm looking forward to seeing your book and where you're going with that. I do want to point out on a framing level too, that I do think that there is a really critical wing, I wouldn't even say single voice, a large number of people that really should be part of this debate. This is, I think, a fairly narrow debate in important ways. Like, there's several views that I think everyone on the panel, Michael, Bill, Andrew, John, are in entire agreement with. So things like, they would agree that the image of God is unique to Adam and Eve's lineage. Not everyone agrees with that. They would all agree that the image of God is essentially a substantialist or structuralist sort of view of the image of God. I'd say the majority of exegetes disagree with that. Actually, Collins is kind of in that view too. I'd say the majority of exegetes, this is my interpretation, people can disagree with that. I'm just saying that's a pretty large community that needs to be included in this.
Actually, I showed the functionalists as well.
I know that, but I think I'm still clustering you for this, and I think it's a fair cluster because I think in a lot of ways you're theologically seeing how far you could take that type of view forward, versus there's an entire different approach to the image of God that completely changes the calculus here. And I mean, I actually find myself agreeing with many of the criticisms being leveled against Craig and Andrew on the level of thinking, well, I just don't think that's the best approach. I think there's a better approach. I think it's still a faithful approach that's consistent with Scripture, might even be internally coherent. And I understand actually the value in the church of those ideas we've discussed. But I really do think that we need to be thinking about how to engage with this, maybe like a kind of like the second camp. That's a pretty large camp of approaches that are more similar to what was in my book. That's the only thing I'd say. And just briefly, it's the idea that either you take the image of God as entirely vocational, or the image of God comes before Adam and Eve. And that decouples this idea of humanness from when humanness arises from when Adam and Eve arise in history. And if you decouple that, that really alleviates most of the tension with science. It also allows you to kind of, like you were saying, I also hold that humans were interbreeding with non-humans. That is categorically false. I entirely reject that. I say that Adam and Eve's lineage was breeding with non-Adamic people who were fully human. They had equal humanness with him. And so there may be criticisms of my work. That is not a valid one. That is just a categorically false criticism. And I think there's a lot of reasons, I could be wrong. We could debate those. But I think that position is really worth having alongside these as we're kind of working this out. So that's it.
All right, thank you. So I'm asking Dr. Nathan French here to help with the general question and answer period. One thing I would like to say is make sure that your question is actually in the form of a question and not just a personal statement that you would like to make. Also indicate if the question is for a particular panelist or for the panel as a whole. But other than that, I'm going to let Dr. French take over. Thank you.
All right, good afternoon, or should I say good evening? Yeah. All right, question. Yeah, let's go for it. Oh,
Wait, did your 2-minute talk?
do we still have time for that?
Yeah.
Yeah, all right. Oh, sorry.
Okay. I wasn't sure. Okay. Hold on, I'm going to come back to you, okay? So I have a 2-minute spiel I get to do too, I guess. So, good afternoon. My name is Nathan French. I'm one of the co-authors with Dr. Keas and Dr. Luskin, helping to bring the scholarship of the Hebrew Bible in the Near East to our book on the historical Adam. Thank you all for your wonderful discussion here today. To use the words of C. John Collins, I want us to consider what new scenario might come to the fore if we examine certain studies and topics within the domains of Hebrew Bible and Near Eastern studies relevant to the historical Adam in Genesis 1 through 11 that are, I think, currently missing from this discussion. So, for example, divine embodiment by Benjamin Summer in the Greater Near East and the Hebrew Bible would elucidate its centrality as a motif in Genesis 1 through 11 and provide further clarification on definitions of genre for Genesis 1 through 11. Furthermore, Hebrew Bible motif of humans as the images/idols of the Lord, Genesis 1 through 11, is quintessential, as we have heard so much here, to understanding the meaning of the first man and woman, not to mention for understanding the purpose of humanity in Genesis 1 through 11. I think of Catherine McDowell's work, which would be integral here. Additionally, said motif in Genesis 1 through 11 is foundational for the continuance of the theme of divine sonship within the Pentateuch as an Israelite critique of the ritualistic creation of idols and images in the Greater Near East. And moreover, we should consider the works of scholars emphasizing the traditions of prophetic scribal culture in Mesopotamia and ancient Israel and what said tradition may mean for divine revelation within Genesis 1 through 11. I think of Alan Lindsay's work. Also, the theme of interpreting primeval history in light of the Babylonian exile is necessary to glean its continuity within Genesis 1 through 11. I think of Hilge Kronvig's work especially. Finally, in immense gratitude to our presenters, I'll end with this statement, which I think all of us would agree with here. Without first taking seriously the meaningfulness of Genesis 1 through 11, how these chapters make sense within their ancient context, and how they were interpreted by their ancient audiences, a task riddled with unending complexity and in need of much prayer, I fear that the historical Adam will remain anything but historical. Okay, so we're going to go to questions. We're going to go right back to you here.
So my question is for Dr. Loke, but not only. So we know that Abraham's wife Sarah was his half-sister, and from his half-sister proceeded the people of God, Isaac, etc. And so it's not stated in the chronological order, Adam and Eve had Cain and Abel, then Abel died, was killed, and then Cain has a wife. And so we know that later Adam and Eve had more children. I'm not a theologian, but I have always assumed that Cain married one of his sisters, which at that time was God. Why could that not be the case as opposed to a non-human?
Yeah. Thank you for the question. Now, I'm not excluding the possibility that Cain did have one of his sisters as his wife. But then again, the Bible also doesn't say explicitly that is the case, right? So that's why in my book, I'm considering various possibilities, right? It could be or it could be not, right? It could be a human or it could be a non-human anatomical homo. And so I consider all these various possibilities, and I say that one of these possibilities may help us to make sense of how Adam and Eve, as written in the Bible, can be compatible with population genetics, which indicates that the genetic diversity of all the humans alive today came down from a large population of, say, for example, 10,000 individuals. Right? So that is the data that I'm trying to account for And I propose a possible model to show how that can work. Yeah.
My question is for Dr. Craig. If we compare it with the Gospels, that there are signs of their reliability which are not necessary conditions to identify them as reliable, would there be a threshold or a specific number of these family resemblances with myth that a narrative must meet to consider it mytho-history?
If I understand the question, Raul, you're saying how many of these family resemblances need to be exhibited by a piece of literature to fall under that classification? I don't think you can probably set a figure like that. After all, they need to be weighed, not just counted. But I think that Genesis 1 to 11 certainly do exhibit a number and weighty number of these family resemblances of myth to justify saying that these are at least quasi-mythical.
Dr. Gregg, I had a question. Based on your mytho-historical view, what is your account of original sin?
I think that there was an original sin in the sense of a primal sin. You remember I quoted Henri Brochet saying what we have is an account of the historical fall, not a historical account of the fall. That is to say, there was a primal sin by Adam and Eve that opened the floodgates of sin so that it came into the world, and this resulted in spiritual death and alienation from God, just as Paul describes in Romans 5. What I would not agree with, though, on theological grounds, would be the imputation of Adam's sin to all of his progeny. I do not see that it's certainly not taught in Genesis 3, and I don't think it's even taught in Romans 5. So I don't think that there is an imputation of Adam's guilt to every one of us. Secondly, I don't see taught in Scripture that there's an inherent corruption of human nature that is hereditary and gets passed on, such as Augustine thought. And so while I would agree with a primal sin, I don't agree with either imputation of guilt or corrupted human nature.
Yeah.
So my question is both for Dr. Craig and Dr. Loke. So if what you just said, like sin is not hereditary, why not the model of Genesis 1 when it says God created mankind or humans as his image, male and female? Why not that be God's image and not in Adam and Eve as so Adam and Eve as representatives, not as the one that only have God's image? I understand. So why not that model? If it is not hereditary, and that will save the problem of intervening with non-humans, because you have a population in evolutionary theory. You have a population of humans that are our ancestors.
This relates to Michael Keas' allusion to my comment that we need to understand Genesis 1 to 11 in the context of the whole Pentateuch. And the point there was not to be applying these family resemblances elsewhere in Scripture. The point was, what is the purpose of this primeval history? Why is it there? Why not just begin with the call of Abraham and the history of Israel? And I think that commentators on Genesis are fairly well agreed that the purpose of the primeval history is that it is a preface to the Pentateuch as a whole to emphasize the universality of human descent from Adam and Eve, that this was the primal pair that God created, not just a selected pair, but the founding pair of the human race, and that thereafter sin and death and judgment and grace and the whole narrative evolves from there. So this is more detailed in the book, but I think it's that universalizing interest of the primeval history that should lead us to think that Adam and Eve are the primal founding pair of humanity.
Thank you for your question. Now, the main motivation for my view is actually, one of the main motivation is in Romans chapter 5. It says that sin enters the world through one, right? And that's the reason why I hold to Adam and Eve as the soul, not soul, I mean, as the one, as God's image bearers and from whom all descend, right? I don't hold to imputation of guilt as well. I agree with Dr. Craig, but I do hold to a view of there's a corruption of human nature, corruption of the image, right, that comes from Adam and Eve, and that's the reason why I hold to them, right, and they are, and then not saying, and so I hope that answers the question. Thanks.
Good. Then back here. Yep.
Question for Dr. Keas. The question is are you familiar with various publications that have published that large percentage of populations outside of or of the world have a certain percent of Neanderthal DNA? And if you are familiar with that, how do you reconcile that with more traditional or conservative views of Adam and Eve?
Yeah, well, if Adam and Eve were created 500K or back further, or if I'm very open to Dr. Craig's view that Adam and Eve could go back to 700 to 1 million years ago.
I'm astonished. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
I mean, we hardly.
It was in my longer paper that I sent you. Yeah, it was in there. Anyway.
We basically then agree. What are we arguing about?
Do you think that Eve was derived as a genetically modified organism or derived from Adam?
That is an utter triviality compared to the historicity of these figures, their location in history, that you're going to be willing to put 500,000 years ago rather than recently. I mean, that's a minor point. And as I said, I don't even know what it means to say that she derived from him if the story is pictorial and symbolic.
Collins says it's a mixture of literal and figurative. It's both. Yeah,
well, okay, but what does that mean then?
So Adam has a part that's missing.
That's not what derive means. Paul says Adam was formed first and then Eve, right? Well, I can affirm that on my view, that there's a chronological priority. Is that what derived means? If the story is pictorial?
A mixture of pictorial and literal, and so the idea that Adam lost a piece and then he gets something back that's better. And furthermore, it's the idea that Eve was not derived from an animal, which you speculate that Eve was derived from
as
a genetically modified organism.
Yeah,
where you have floating molecules instead of a floating rib.
No, it's a possibility.
I know, right?
Well, I'm talking like Andrew Loke here. We want to entertain a variety of possibilities. But you see, I look at why, on a pictorial account of Eve, you would think Adam has a missing piece. A part of his body that's gone. I mean, that's the very opposite of pictorial, Michael. That's hyper.
Let's do another question here, shall we? I'm interested in more. Yeah, back here, go.
Maybe Dr. Craig or Dr. Keas, can you just comment on the importance of historical reality of Christian worldview? You would say that, I assume you say that if the parable of the prodigal son, that was a historical event and wouldn't add any more to the teaching than the parable. But we don't say the same thing about the resurrection of Jesus, because that can just be this metaphorical, true but not factual. When we think of whether it's Jonah, Job, Genesis 1 through 11, the importance or not of its connection to history. How does the Christian worldview, how do you weigh that? How symbolic can it be, metaphorical versus historical? How do you weigh that out?
Well, I think one way that this is really important is, for example, Josh Swamidass has recently said that an excellent book is Nathan Lent's book called The Sexual Evolution, not Revolution, but Sexual Evolution, where he argues for gender fluidity and so on, based on the animal origins of humans. He said it on X. I've got a screen capture of it. Wait, let me finish. Now, obviously, he probably didn't mean all the book was excellent, and you can nuance that and so on. But the point is that the theological resources for current gender theology biblical theology for biblical manhood and womanhood, even not even getting specific enough to your issue, but just in terms of the transgender issue, I think that if Eve were a genetically modified organism from an animal, God would also have to erase the genetic tendencies to engage in acts that are well documented in natural history in terms of same-sex and multiple mates. Yeah, I mean, so it would involve a lot of genetic engineering, Bill. It's not just a few molecules, okay? It would involve a lot of genetic engineering. And so, I just think that, that's an example of where it's important for current Christian worldview.
Dr. Craig, did you want to respond to the question back here, or no? Was that
No, I don't.
Dr. Keas? Okay.
Let's move on.
Yeah, go for it.
For Dr. Keas, if you could help me understand if Eve was made de novo or just out of nothing, do you still consider her a GMO? Or I think I misunderstand why she's a genetically modified organism if she's made just out of nothing and placed with Adam.
Well, the GMO comment was from Dr. Craig's book, that he speculates as one option, of course not the only option, but one of the options, and that would involve microsurgery, if you will, that you couldn't visibly see, as opposed to a macrosurgery with a rib removed. But the Eve derived from Adam would involve Adam missing a piece, and then God building Eve in such a way that she was, she was not like the whole point was she was not like the animal. She was not derived from animals. She was derived from a human. And so human sexuality, the conclusion of that historical narrative argument is therefore marriage with one mate, ideally, and as opposed to animals who have multiple mates.
Yeah, back here.
Dr. Craig, just following up on a previous statement you made, you said you don't believe that Adam's sin was imputed to humanity. So I'd just like to ask you, what do you think was passed on, since we read in Genesis 3?
This is really a great question.
All of sin and fall short of the glory of God.
I'm very attracted to Thomas Aquinas' view of the effects of the fall. What Aquinas holds is that in the state of innocence, man had what he called a superadded grace, which some theologians have identified with the Holy Spirit, which enabled Adam and Eve to control their bodily impulses of their hominid animal nature. These were subject to the rational soul, which by the superadded grace of God was able to live a sinless life. But when they sinned, this superadded grace was withdrawn from them, so that they were no longer able to control those animal appetites of their physical body, which then lead to selfishness, sin, and all the rest of the deficits of sin. So on this view, human nature is not depraved, but it's deprived. It suffers a privation of that original superadded grace that was given through the Holy Spirit. And that enables you to get this sort of hereditary nature of sin, why all people instinctively sin, but without the bizarre idea that a morally corrupt nature could be passed on genetically, like St. Augustine thought, that somehow through sexual intercourse, sin is passed on, which is just bizarre, I think. But so look at Aquinas' view on this.
All right, good. Back here.
Yeah, in Genesis 1, Genesis 2, it says that God created everything according to its kind, so a seed and a tree, the plant is there. Same thing with male and female animals, everything according to its kind. And then God created Eve by taking genetic material from Adam. And Adam says what? This is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. My question is for Dr. Not Loke, sorry.
Loke.
Where did you come up with the idea that there was something else outside that God created that human beings could procreate with? If everything was created according to their kind and there was male and female?
Thank you for the question. Now, first of all, this phrase, according to the kinds in the Hebrew, lamim, if you read an article written by Richard Hess, Old Testament scholar, published in the Biola website, it clarifies that what it means is that God created various kinds. It doesn't mean fixed kinds, right? So it doesn't exclude the evolutionary picture. Now, as to your question. Now, on my view, Eve was created out of Adam, actually. So I do hold to the view that Keas was defending, actually. So on that point, I differ from Dr. Craig, actually. But it doesn't exclude the possibility that there could be already other kinds of identical homo outside. So God created various kinds, right? But then out of these kinds, God also specially created the soul of Adam. And that's why Adam is unique, because he's the God's image bearers. So that's how I see this, and I don't see any conflict with what the Bible says.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'll say the question, and I think I'll want could you follow up? Thank you. I'll say the question, and I think I'll want a follow-up, and I want to thank all the panelists as well. What is the status on your views of the visions? One example being the establishment of the Abrahamic covenant came through a vision that God gave Abraham. Am I getting that part right?
Thinking of Genesis 15, is that what you're thinking?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Does this at all strengthen, and I'll say the follow-up now, does this at all strengthen William Lane Craig's view, Dr. Craig's view, in that God is more than comfortable using, like, dreams are not real in the same way that this chair is real, and he uses it as a means to provide genuine revelation that is meant to be submitted to and operated by. Does that? I wondered about that in relation to this debate. And even there's a former professor of mine who suggests that when Adam was asleep, God did not do literal surgery, but rather revealed a vision of the status of Eve's relationship to Adam.
Yeah. Same term used there in Genesis 15 and in 3:2.
That's the very claim that you made, yeah.
Yeah.
Please.
What do you think, Dr. Craig?
There are two kinds of human descriptions of God in the Old Testament. One would be just anthropomorphic language. For example, God riding on the clouds, and the arm of the Lord, or the eyes of the Lord are upon the righteous, his ear is open to their prayer. These aren't meant to be taken literally. It's just anthropomorphic descriptions of God. On the other hand, you do have these theophanies, where God seems to be able to appear to someone, like, say, Moses in the cleft of the rock, or other places where God can form a materialization that someone will see. And the question that we're arguing about is, you've got these descriptions of God in Genesis 2 and 3 that portray God as a humanoid deity, walking in the garden, looking for Adam and Eve, forming a dirt statue and breathing into its nose and stuff. And so the questions are these just anthropomorphic descriptions, or is this literal? Is this a literal theophany of God? And it seems to me that given the Pentateuchal author's commitment to God's transcendence in chapter 1, he's not a physical object. He doesn't have a human form. That we should understand these narratives in Genesis 2 and 3 figuratively, or as Collins would put it, pictorially. And that we're not obligated to think that God actually appeared to Adam and Eve in the way that he did to Abraham by the oaks of Mamre, when it says, and the Lord appeared. You've got the language of theophany right there, and you don't have it in Genesis 2 and 3. So isn't it more plausible to think that this is just part of the pictorial imagery?
But Vern Poythress, a leading scholar on the topic of theophany with a monograph on it, he says that even if it weren't theophany, he says the language shows us it could have been a theophany, but even if it weren't, it doesn't have to literally say God appeared. Often the text shows us things it doesn't literally tell us. This is one of Collins' principal points. And over and over he said this. And you insist, it seems, you have to literally tell God appeared or something similar, something similar language. And oftentimes God can show without telling. And then Poythress says, even if it wasn't a theophany, he still thinks, like Collins and me, and even Loke, that Eve was derived from Adam's side. Adam had a missing part. Whether it's macro surgery or microsurgery, we're just talking about different levels of surgery. And so you're open to the micro, but apparently not the macro.
Unfortunately, we're out of time, I think.